Hello everyone, my name is Kwon and I work at Korea Institute for Curriculum and Evaluation. The title of today's talk is The Impact of Presenting Videos in an L2 Listening Comprehension Test. It's an eye tracking study, which is a new technology used as a research method to measure test takers' cognitive processes as revealed in their eye movements. So I'm going to get to this more details while talking about this study. So today, the video has become a primary sources of content, and we use videos in various fields, including academic lectures to all other kinds of media. But its use in language assessment has remained tentative. And there's not much of studies that looked at this effect of specific visual cues, although there's been a few studies that investigated the impact of video per se. And that's why we need more studies that look into the process of validations, both in terms of the context and cognitive validity of introducing these videos in our listening comprehension test. So the aims is to understand how presence of visual cues in a listening test affect our L2 candidates' listening comprehension process and also their performance. And there's a large number of studies who looked into this impact of videos, as I said, but they looked at the video as a whole instead of looking at the process of looking at each video cues. So a large number of studies show that there's a positive impact of having the videos in a listening test. And there are also some negative or some skeptical views about introducing videos in a test largely because it's not really the true construct that we are measuring in a listening test. So it's still a slightly controversial issue, although more recent studies argue that the video is a more plausible way to assess listening test. And there are also a few studies that looked at the interactions with visual cues in a video listening test. And a few of the studies actually employed eye tracking studies as this study. Just to go bit more details about these studies, the Oki in 2007 and the Wagner, they used the video cameras to capture the test takers' viewing behavior. And the Oki actually also employed the retrospective verbal protocol methods to ask the test takers whether the video was helpful or distracting. And recent years, there's been a few eye tracking studies that looked into the video listening test context. And Suvorov was probably the first study who have done this approach. He compared the impact of content visuals versus the context visuals. I'm going to get to this in a minute. And Batty also looked at a similar topic, and he focused more on test takers' interactions with visual cues. And Winke and Lim in 2014, they also employed eye tracker to measure test takers' use of test wiseness strategies and also their test anxiety level. So although we have a few studies that have made some new approach to look into the impact of video in a listening test, I believe that we still need more evidence on where and why test takers look at certain visual cues in a video listening test. So here are some of the gaps that I summarized. So the first gap is that we know little about the extent to which candidates view specific visual cues when video is introduced to a listening comprehension test. And gap 2 is that there are a limited number of studies that looked into the individual variability in cognitive processes, often dealing with eye movements in these studies particularly. And gap 3 is that the existing studies have not fully investigated the effect of visuals on various listening scenarios that resembles more variety of our real-life listening scenes. A lot of the existing studies, they've focused on the academic lecture items only, not necessarily the dialogues or some more authentic situations. So here are some theoretical backgrounds for the study. So I'm going to use Pavio's dual coding theory and Mayer's dual channel assumptions to explain why having the visuals in a listening comprehension process is important. So they said that the multimodal presentations offer deeper understanding to learners because they can mentally connect pictorial and verbal presentations. And this facilitates learning. So this is what actually happens to us when we learn something through some visual materials. So it happens all the time. So in a multimedia presentation, we use words and pictures together, and that's processed in our sensory memory using our ears and eyes. And then they move on to the working memory, where we process the sounds and images to organize them into verbal or pictorial model. And finally, we use our long-term memory, and which is also known as prior knowledge, background knowledge, and they are integrated together with this working memory to understand something and facilitate learning. So moving on to research questions, there are 4 research questions for this study, but I'm just going to go through the first 3 of them because of the amount of time allowed for me to give a talk today. So the first question is about the extent to which visual cues in a video listening test have an effect on second language learners' listening performance. I'm going to look at the test performance aspects. And the second question is, to what extent do candidates view the video prompts and the item components during the video listening comprehension test? So in a simple way, it's about where and how much they look at these components during the test. And the third question is, to what extent do candidates' individual variability in viewing each visual and item components has an effect on listening test performance? So the amount of time they look at either visual cues or the test item components might have an effect on test performance is the question that I'm going to explore today. Okay, so for this study, I had 117 high school students in Korea. They are aged between 16 to 18. And as a test materials, I selected 15 items from retired items of the English subtest of the CSAT. So I looked at the 2011 to 2016 items, and also used some of the retired items from the National English Listening Test, known as NELT. And finally, 15 items were selected from them, and I created them in a CBT platform, and I also created videos. So I used the identical prompt scripts used for these retired items and created video base. So in a listening test phase, I allocated the 57 participants into the audio-only group and 60 participants in the video group. So only the video group will receive the test in a video stimuli. And in the eye tracking phase, the same participants were participated. So the same, while they're completing the test, we collected their eye movements simultaneously. But because of the calibration successful rate, we dropped a few participants from the listening test phase. So we only had 53 candidates in the audio-only group and 57 candidates in the video group. So here is how one of our items looked like. So in the video group, we had 2 speakers in a dialogue, and they are actually giving exchanging conversation based on the identical scripts that's used for the CSAT or the NELT items. And this is for the academic lecture items. So basically, there's just only one lecturer giving a lecture, but there's also the PPT slides that the lecturer used, which are semantically congruent with the talk. Okay. And for the eye tracking method, I used the Tobii X260 eye tracking device, which has a sampling rate at 60 Hz, which is good enough to do some studies like mine, because I'm not looking at each words or sentence level reading studies, which in that case, you might need a better sampling rate. But for mine, which is just looking at the areas in a large chunk in a video, 60 Hz was good enough. So with this, I examined what occurred on the screen, including the mouse movements, clicks, and obviously the candidate's eye movements, which was recorded while they're doing these tasks. So I'm just going to briefly go through what an eye tracking method is. So in eye tracking, we use these 2 major metrics, I would say. So first is the saccades. This is about the moving from one area to the other area. So this is what we do when we're reading a sentence. We read from left to the right. Sometimes we go back to the previous region, which is called the regression saccades. On the other hand, fixation is an interval between eye movements, where the eyes stop in a certain area, and we measure how long they stopped for on certain area. So in theory, when we have a longer fixation on certain area, it often means that there's a processing difficulties, or they're concentrating, and there are other regions that we can ask further with the participants. But in most cases in reading, it's usually the comprehension difficulties or cognitive loads identified through this longer fixation rate. Okay, there are different types of eye trackers. So the one that I use is what I'm just showing you now is a bar type. So you actually attach this to a monitor or a laptop, and you can simply ask your subjects to process some kind of tasks, and it automatically collects the eye movements of the participants. There are also some head-mounted versions, or the glass type ones. They're also used in different areas of studies, but sometimes they're not really ideal for this kind of language studies because they're affected by the head movements or body movements. Okay, and the data that we get from the eye tracking method is firstly we get the quantified the statistical data. So this is how one of my raw gauge data look like. It's quite a lot of volume of data that you need to clean and kind of extract from the software. So it takes quite a substantial amount of time when you have to clean the data and also the analyzing the data. And we can also get some of the visualized data, say gauge plots or the heat maps, which also shows how much the participants looked at certain areas and for how long or how much. By more intuitively, you can get this kind of information using the visualized images. And I also conducted stimulated recall interview to cross-check what is shown in the eye movement is what actually happened. So basically, we cross-checked what's shown in the eye movement with the subject to make sure that what is shown in the eye movements is what they were thinking, and we also asked the rationals for certain viewing behaviors so that we can get more rich data and explanations about their cognitive processes. So it's actually strongly recommended that you do this stimulated recall interview followed by the eye tracking. Okay, and for all eye tracking studies, you always have to define the areas of interest. So what it is that you define certain areas that you are going to use as a variables. I'm going to show you in a minute, but for my study, I used stem, key, distractor, speaker, and the slide as my areas of interest to use them as variables in my analysis. For example, in the dialogue items, you can see that there are two speakers. So I define these two boxes around it, and also the stem, one small long box, and distractor, 4 boxes, and 1 key box. So basically, this is the areas where we have the eye movements who come in and come out, and who actually stays within that areas of interest, which are calculated into different variables. And same thing for the lecture items. I had another AUI called PPT slide. So this is how we assign different areas within the stimuli to calculate the amount of time viewing each variable. So there are different metrics that you can use to analyze the eye movement data. For me, I used the 6 measures. So visit count is number of times they visited each area. Fixation count is smaller units. Each fixation unit is within the AUIs, and fixation duration is mean single fixation duration on each area. Visit duration is one long visit durations, mean single durations within one single visit. And total visit duration is combinations of all visit durations on each AUI. Total fixation duration is also the combined fixation durations on each AUI. And proportion of total fixation duration is a percentage value that is manually calculated based on the total fixation durations on all areas. So you get the percentage of time spent on each AOI. Get to this in a minute, showing you the result. So for data analysis, we compare the group score between the audio-only group and the video groups using the MAT-U test because of the non-parametric, because of the non-normality of the data. And for individual item score difference, I used the logistic regression models to measure the effect of video. And I also measured the random effects using the cross-classified multi-level model. So here are the some linear regression models I use. So as I said, I use each AY as a variable. So having the total score as a dependent variables, and I had a stem, distractor, key, speaker, and PPT slide as my parameters. Okay, now the results. So firstly, I'm going to talk about the test score difference between the audio only and the video groups. So the results show that the groups in video group scored higher than the audio only group by 1.10. So maximum score is 15, and this was statistically significant at the 0.05 level. So basically, the video group performed better than the audio only group. Okay, and next I looked at the item score for individual item. So you see that in all items except for the item number 1 and number 4, the video group outperformed the audio only groups. And when I fit them in a logistic regression model, I found that item 2, number 6, and number 12, the positive effect of video was statistically significant. So in general, having the video has facilitated the test takers' listening performance positive way. Okay, moving on to look at the random effect. So I fitted the cross-classified logistic model, having the test taker level random effects and the item level random effects in a cross-classified format. And I fitted the video as the dummy variables and the baseline test scores, which is conducted before the main study, as one of the parameters. And then I calculated the variance partition coefficients using this classified logistic model equations. And here's the results. So if you look at just the various components models and also compare that to the cross-classified model, you'll see that by fitting the video to proficiency, you have a smaller DIC level, which means that having the cross-classified model is a better fit model. And you can also see that the video had a positive significant effect. When we compare that with just a simple model, not the cross-classified model, so when you don't fit the random part, you'll see that the DIC level is much larger than the cross-classified model, so which explains that the cross-classified model is much better fit than the single level model. So it's better to look at the random part to explain the phenomena more accurately. So also we had a positive effect, as I showed you earlier. And when we look at the various partition coefficients by calculating them in the item levels and the test taker level separately, you see we found that the 33.7% of variation of a probability of a correct answer lies between the items. But when you look at the test taker levels, there's only 8.8% of variation explained by this explained by the test taker level, which explains that the VPC, the item level random effects, is much larger than the test taker level. Now moving on to the eye movement findings. Here's descriptive statistics for the fixation count value. You can see that they looked at the speaker much more frequently, and also the PPT slides very frequently compared to the stem or answer choice. When we compare that to the audio group, you can see that the audio group looked at the question distractors key much more frequently than the video group, and they're also statistically significant. And when we look at the proportion of total fixation durations, just to give you a better idea more intuitively, we can find that they spent about 61% of time viewing the speaker, and they spent just about 21% time distractor, 12% on the stem, only 6% on the. And in the lecture items, when we had the PPT slides as well, you can see that they spend about 50% of time looking at the speaker, about 19% of time looking at the PPT slides, combine them together, it's just about the 69% of time looking at the visual cues. Compared to that, question and answer choices, much less proportion of time spent on this on reading the item. So here's a better view of showing you the proportion of total fixation duration. So they looked at in dialogues, speakers for 61% of times, more than half proportion looking at the visual cues. Same thing with the lecture items. As I said, there's 69% of time combined both the speakers and the slides, which is almost 70% of time viewing the visual cues compared to the item components is much larger proportions. And we also did some of the additional analysis using the common AOIs only, which is stem, distracted, and key options. So what it is that if we ignore the visual cues in the calculations, how would the result be like? And we compare that using this common AIs only in terms of the proportions of total fixation durations, you'll see that there's not much of difference anymore when we ignore the visual cues. So this is what we saw before. They looked at the audio only group looked at the question and distract and key much longer proportion than the video group, obviously because they didn't have the videos. And while the video groups had spent much longer time looking at the visual cues, and they have naturally looked at the question and answer choices much shorter period of time. However, when we ignore the visual cues and compare the three common AOIs only in the calculations, we see that there's not much of a difference any longer. And next is the linear regression model findings. And first measure we're going to look at is fixation count. So if we fitted this AOIs in linear regression models, we found that looking at the distractors longer will lead to the drop in the test score, wherein if you look at the key options longer, you will have a positive effect. But when you look at the speakers or slides, there's not much of statistical significant effect on total. On the other hand, if you look at total fixation durations, if you look at the distractors or the speakers longer, you'll have significant negative effect on test score. Whereas if you look at key options longer, you have a positive effect. For proportion of total fixation duration, we fitted the models for dialogues and lectures separately, and used the subscores of as a response variable. And similar results were shown. If you look at the distractors longer, they have some negative effects, and if you look at the key options longer, you have a positive effect, and there's not much of significant effect of the speakers or the slides. Okay, so that's all the findings, and just to summarize the key findings of the studies, we found that the video group performs better than the audio only group, and we found that the candidate spends substantial amount of time viewing the visual cues, often the speakers and the PPT slides in this case, more than the item components. We also found that this positive effect of viewing the video cue is much more to do with the item effect more than the test taker random effect. We found that the viewing the distractors had a debilitating effect on test scores, when viewing the key option has a facilitating effect. Viewing the speakers had either no effect or the weak negative effect, but viewing the PPT slides generally had a positive effect on test scores, but they were not statistically significant. On the other chapters of this project, we looked at the effect of the PPT slides more specifically using the stimulate recall interview findings. So I'm not going to talk about that in today's talk, but generally test takers reported that they found the PPT slides the most beneficial in arriving at the answer. Okay, and audio only group generally view the question and answer options longer and more frequently than the video groups. This is an obvious finding because they have nowhere else to look but the question and answer choices, so they spend longer time. But when we calculate the proportion values while ignoring the viewing duration on the visual cues, so basically when we compare the common AOIs only, we no longer found significant difference between the two groups. And here is the changes in our cognitive processes by the test mode. So in the audio only conditions, which is traditional listening situations, we can find that the most test takers spend most of their time reading the stem and the answer choices. On the other hand, when video is introduced to the listening test, we can see that they spend more time now on the visual cues. So they were looking at the speakers as if they're listening to the conversations in real life. They also look at the STEM and answer choice to complete the tasks, but they spend much less than the audio-only group, but they still outperform the audio-only group. So when this new test-taking strategy was found in the video listening test, they have much reduced time reading the question and options, and they also show some switching attention between the videos and items. And finally, with all these strategies, their scores were improved. So I think the effect of viewing the cues, visual cues in a listening performance is not simply about how much they look at them. It's about how they interact with the visual cues, which is more meaningful. So here is some of the visual sample gauge plots that I actually found from my study. So you can see how they switch their attention between the answer options and the speakers or the PPT slides. So that's what they actually do during the test, listening and watching, and also completing the listening tasks by reading the answer options to select. So often they matched what they heard with the answer options to find what the answer is. So in sum, video group generally spend less amount of time and less number of times reading the question and answer options, but they still outperform the audio-only group. So the conclusion that I arrive is that the video group had enough time to read the question and answer choices to complete the tasks. It's just the visual cues supported their comprehensions, and sometimes some low level participants, the video had compensated their lack of listening ability, and that improved their test performance as well. So if you look at, if I show you this chart, so basically the audio-only group and the video group, they're given in the same condition in terms of the reading their question and answer choices. They're shown the exact same question and answer choice for the exact same amount of time. But the difference is that when video is introduced, they spend much shorter and less frequent amount of time looking at this question answer choices. And then they process and complete the tasks. In both groups do this the same way. But because of having the visuals, they watch the videos. And because they have additional information, which are the visual cues, the way of reading the answer choices now become different. And the level of performance also was affected by this new condition. And I should also mention about the validity issues. So I'm going to use the WAIRs, the social cognitive frameworks, which dealt with context and cognitive validity issues. So in terms of context, we should talk about the settings in a video-mediated or computer-based listening test. And also in terms of cognitive validity issues, we should think about the process, the ways to process the input to complete the given tasks. So these two context and cognitive validity issues should be discussed together when introducing videos in the future conventional listening test. And in terms of the target language use domain, listening process resembles real-life listening situations in terms of the interacting with your cues to decode the given listening input. Should be a key issue and elements to consider in developing the future listening test. So because listening test with a visual input improves the face validity and is a better representation of the target language use domain. So before I conclude, so how are we going to use videos in language learning and also language assessment? So in language learning context, we use videos in many language classroom teaching and learning perspectives. So, but in the past, we used more of as passive listening and answer drills. But by introducing videos, we can do more of interactions with the visual inputs. So extensive use of video allows teachers to create more creative activities using its own distinctive features, and it adds flexibility in teaching methods. But teachers should also be careful not to include too much textual information to turn the tasks into a reading activity. So it should still be a listening activity by showing the visuals as a supplementary materials. And in terms of language testing, there are positive implications and negative implications. So when having videos, it enhances authenticity. It provides more realistic listening experience. And as I said, it enhances face validity, and it provides significant complementary effect on the listening comprehension performance. And we can also introduce some of the new item types, which is not just a simple two-way conversation. We can also introduce the same gender conversations or more interactive lecture types. We can also remove some of the old items which asks to identify the scene or relationships between the speakers, because in real life we don't really need to identify these kind of things because we can actually see them in real life. And some of the negative issues that we should also consider is that there is a high cost of producing the videos, and the consensus on introducing videos in listening tests has not been established yet. And there could also be some possible bias effect that we should be careful of. And sometimes it might not be suitable for young children who lack of familiarity to the computerized test platform. So we should also keep that in mind. Okay. And in conclusions, I think we need a new visual listening construct. And for that, we need to have a construct map of listening assessment, which should include interactions with visuals and oral cues, and also comprehension of both verbal and non-verbal cues. So I'm going to finish up by suggesting some of the future studies in relation to this present study. I think we can just try some of the different response mode of listening tests, such as the short answer or the summarization tasks. And we can also try replicate this study by giving the access to the question and answer choices after the prompt is played. And we can do some of the item analysis using some techniques like manufactured Rush models on the specific distractive effect. So that's all for me. Thanks a lot for listening. If you have any questions or comments, please email me to this email address. Thank you.